The morning mist clung to the Massachusetts countryside like a shroud over sleeping villages. But Captain John Parker's hands trembled not from the April chill, but from the weight of destiny pressing upon his shoulders. It was the 19th of April, 1775, and the 7-7 Minutemen assembled on Lexington Green had no idea they were about to fire the shots that would echo through history. As the beginning of America's war for independence, the seeds of this confrontation had been planted years earlier, nurtured by British policies that squeezed the colonial purse and trampled upon rights the colonists held sacred. The Stamp Act of 1765 had been the first cruel twist of the knife, followed by the Townshend Acts and the suffocating grip of the Tea Act. But it was the intolerable acts of 1774 that had finally pushed the Massachusetts colonists beyond the breaking point. These punitive measures, designed to punish Boston for the Tea Party, had instead united the colonies in righteous indignation. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor of Massachusetts, found himself sitting atop a powder keg of colonial resentment. Intelligence reports flooded his Boston headquarters daily, speaking of secret meetings, hidden weapons caches, and the growing boldness of the colonial militia. The most troubling reports centered on Concord, a small town 20 miles northwest of Boston, where the provincial Congress had allegedly stored a significant arsenal of military supplies. The decision to march on Concord was not made lightly. Gage understood that such an aggressive move would likely provoke a violent response. But King George III's government had made its position clear. The rebellion must be crushed. Before it could spread beyond Massachusetts, the general's orders were explicit: seize the weapons at Concord and arrest the ringleaders of the resistance, particularly Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were reportedly hiding in the area. On the evening of April 18th, Gage's carefully laid plans began to unfold. 700 British regulars, led by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and Major John Pitcairn, prepared for what they believed would be a routine military operation. These were seasoned soldiers, veterans of European campaigns, confident in their ability to overawe colonial farmers and shopkeepers. But the British had underestimated the efficiency of the colonial intelligence network. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott had already begun their legendary midnight rides, spreading the alarm throughout the countryside. Church bells pealed across the darkness, signal fires blazed from hilltops, and the ancient call to arms echoed through sleeping hamlets. The regulars are coming out. Captain Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, understood the gravity of the situation as he watched his neighbors and kinsmen gather on the village green. These were not professional soldiers, but ordinary men, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants who had left their warm beds to answer their community's call. Some carried muskets passed down from their fathers. Others bore weapons hastily borrowed from neighbors. What they lacked in military bearing, they made up for in determination and intimate knowledge of their homeland. As dawn approached, the British column emerged from the morning mist. Like specters of imperial authority, the redcoats of the advancing soldiers seemed to glow in the pale light, their polished bayonets catching the first rays of the rising sun. The measured tramp of military boots on the dirt road created a rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to count down the final moments of peace between Britain and her American colonies. The confrontation on Lexington Green unfolded with the terrible inevitability of Greek tragedy. Major John Pitcairn, riding at the head of the British advance guard, could see the small group of colonial militia drawn up in formation across the village common. His orders were clear: disperse any armed resistance and continue the march to Concord. What he could not have anticipated was how this seemingly minor encounter would transform into the opening act of a revolution that would reshape the world. Captain Parker, facing overwhelming odds, made a decision that would be debated by historians for centuries. His 7-7 men were vastly outnumbered by the approaching British force. Yet to simply flee would abandon their community to foreign occupation. The choice he made reflected the character of a generation that had been pushed beyond endurance by years of imperial overreach. Stand your ground, Parker commanded his men, his voice carrying across the green with quiet authority. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. These words, recorded by witnesses and passed down through generations, captured the essence of the American spirit: a reluctant, a resolute willingness to fight for principle. Even against impossible odds, the British regulars advanced in perfect formation, their scarlet uniforms and gleaming weapons a stark contrast to the rough homespun clothing at weathered faces of the colonial militia. Major Pitcairn, a professional soldier with years of experience managing colonial unrest, approached the situation with the confidence of a man accustomed to seeing armed civilians disperse at the first show of imperial authority. "Disperse, ye rebels," Pitcairn shouted across the green. "Lay down your arms and disperse." The morning air carried his words clearly to every man present, British and American alike. The moment hung suspended in time, balanced on the edge between peace and war, between colonial subjugation and the birth of a new nation. What happened next would be disputed for generations. In the confusion of the moment, with nervous men on both sides gripping loaded weapons, a single musket discharged. The source of that shot remains a mystery. To this day, some claimed it came from behind a stone wall. Others insisted it was an accidental discharge from a militiaman's weapon. But the identity of the shooter mattered less than the consequences of that one explosive moment. The British regulars, trained to respond instantly to hostile fire, unleashed a devastating volley that shattered the morning calm. The crack of musket fire echoed across the green as colonial militiamen fell wounded and dying on the same ground where their children played and their community gathered for celebrations. 8 Americans lay dead in the aftermath, including Jonathan Harrington, who crawled to his own doorstep to die in his wife's arms. As referenced in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study Paul Revere's Ride, the British had expected this show of force to counter colonial resistance, but instead it had the opposite effect. The sight of their neighbors' blood on Lexington Green transformed what had been political resistance into personal vengeance. Word of the massacre spread through the countryside, faster than the British column could march, carried by riders who added their own embellishments to an already inflammatory story. Major Pitcairn, surveying the scene with growing unease, realized that his mission had taken an unexpected turn. The colonial militia had indeed dispersed, but not in the manner he had anticipated. Instead of returning to their homes in defeat, they had scattered into the surrounding countryside, where they would regroup and prepare for the next confrontation. The British had won the first battle, but in doing so, they had awakened a sleeping giant. The march to Concord continued under an increasingly ominous sky. The British column, originally confident in their ability to complete their mission without significant opposition, now found themselves moving through a landscape that seemed to watch their every step with hostile eyes. Farmhouses stood silent and shuddered, but the soldiers could sense the presence of unseen observers tracking their progress. The transformation of the colonial response was remarkable in its speed and coordination. What had begun as a military operation against a cache of weapons had become a rallying cry for armed resistance throughout Massachusetts. The colonial militia system, developed during decades of frontier warfare, proved remarkably effective at rapid mobilization and communication. The British column's march from Lexington to Concord took on an increasingly sinister character. As the morning progressed, what had begun as a confident military expedition now felt more like a journey into hostile territory. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, the overall commander of the operation, found himself questioning the wisdom of continuing deeper into the Massachusetts countryside. With his force of 700 men, the intelligence that had seemed so reliable in the safety of Boston headquarters now appeared dangerously incomplete. Smith's scouts reported increasing numbers of colonial militia gathering in the woods and hills surrounding the road. These were not the panicked farmers fleeing in terror that British strategists had predicted, but organized groups of armed men moving with purpose and coordination. The colonial response to the Lexington confrontation demonstrated the effectiveness of a communication network that had been years in the making. Riders galloped between towns carrying news of British movements, while church bells and signal fires coordinated the militia response across a wide area. The system that Paul Revere and his compatriots had established for just such an emergency was proving its worth in the crucible of actual conflict. Captain David Brown of the Concord militia received word of the approaching British force. While the echoes of the Lexington volley still seemed to hang in the air, his response reflected the transformation that was occurring throughout the colony. What had been defensive preparations were now offensive operations. The militia was no longer simply hiding weapons and supplies, they were preparing to fight for them. The town of Concord itself presented a strategic challenge that British planners had not fully appreciated. Unlike Lexington, which was essentially a single village green surrounded by houses, Concord was a larger community with multiple approaches and escape routes. The weapons and supplies that the British sought to confiscate were scattered throughout the town, its surrounding countryside, making a quick seizure impossible. Colonel James Barrett, the senior militia commander in the area, had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. The supplies that remained in Concord had been carefully positioned to allow for rapid removal, if necessary, while decoy caches had been established to mislead British intelligence. More importantly, Barrett had developed a comprehensive plan for defending the town that took advantage of the local terrain and the militia's superior knowledge of the area. The North Bridge over the Concord River would prove to be the most significant geographic feature in the coming battle. This narrow wooden span, barely wide enough for a single wagon, represented the primary route between the town center and the surrounding countryside. Control of the bridge would determine whether the British could complete their mission or would find themselves trapped in hostile territory. As the British column finally arrived in Concord around 8 o'clock in the morning, the town appeared deceptively peaceful. Most of the civilian population had fled, leaving behind empty houses and quiet streets that seemed to mock the massive military effort required to reach them. While Lieutenant Colonel Smith was experienced enough to recognize the calm before the storm when he saw it, the British plan for searching Concord revealed the limitations of conventional military thinking. When applied to unconventional warfare, Smith divided his force into several smaller units, each assigned to search specific areas of the town for hidden weapons and supplies. This dispersion of force, while logical for a search operation, created vulnerabilities that the colonial militia was quick to exploit. Major John Buttrick of the Concord Militia watched the British deployment from his position on the hills overlooking the town, the sight of foreign soldiers searching American homes and businesses with the arrogance of conquerors stirred something deep in the hearts of the watching militiamen. This was no longer about taxes or political representation. This was about the fundamental right of a people to govern themselves in their own homes. The British search parties, working methodically through the town, found far less than they had hoped. Most of the weapons and supplies had been successfully hidden or removed, leaving behind only a few cannonballs and some wooden gun carriages. The disappointing results of their search operations added to the growing frustration of soldiers, who had expected to find vast arsenals of rebel weapons. But the most significant discovery was not made by the British searchers, but by the colonial militia observing from the surrounding hills. The division of the British force had created an opportunity that experienced military commanders like Barrett and Buttrick were quick to recognize. For the first time since the confrontation began, the colonial forces actually outnumbered their opponents in a specific location. The morning sun climbed higher over Concord as the tactical situation shifted dramatically in favor of the colonial militia. What had begun as a British search and seizure operation was rapidly evolving into a full-scale military confrontation, with the famous North Bridge serving as the focal point of the struggle. Captain Walter Larry led the British detachment assigned to secure the North Bridge, a force of approximately 100 men from the King's Own Regiment and the 4th Regiment of Foot. His orders were straightforward: prevent any colonial forces from crossing the bridge and interfering with the search operations in the town. What Larry could not have anticipated was that he would soon find himself facing nearly 400 colonial militiamen converging on his position from multiple directions. The colonial forces gathering on the hills beyond the bridge represented a cross-section of Massachusetts society united in common cause. Companies from Concord, Lincoln, Bedford, and other nearby towns had responded to the alarm with remarkable speed and coordination. These were not professional soldiers, but they were experienced fighters who had learned their trade in the brutal warfare of the frontier. Major John Buttrick, now in tactical command of the assembled militia, faced a decision that would test his leadership and his understanding of the political implications of the moment. The British force at the bridge was clearly outnumbered and potentially vulnerable, but an attack would cross the line from defensive resistance to offensive warfare. Once that line was crossed, there would be no return to the uneasy peace that had existed between Britain and her American colonies. The decision was made for him when smoke began rising from the center of Concord. British search parties, frustrated by their inability to find significant weapons caches, had begun burning whatever military supplies they could discover. The smoke that the militiamen saw was actually from a small fire that had been quickly extinguished, but from their position on the hills. It appeared that the British were burning the town itself. "Will you let them burn the town down?" shouted one of the militiamen, his voice carrying the anger and frustration that had been building throughout the morning. The question galvanized the assembled force, transforming what had been a defensive gathering into an offensive operation. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. The colonial militia was no longer simply defending their homes. They were taking active steps to drive out foreign invaders. Major Buttrick's command to advance marked a turning point not just in the day's events, but in the entire relationship between Britain and America. March, march, he ordered, and the colonial column began its advance toward the bridge with a determination that spoke to something deeper than mere military orders. These men were fighting for their homes, their families, and their vision of what America could become. The British position at the North Bridge was tactically sound but strategically untenable. Captain Laurie's men held the high ground on the town side of the bridge, but they were heavily outnumbered and increasingly isolated from their main force. The wooden bridge itself, barely 20 feet long and 8 feet wide, became a bottleneck that would favor the attacking force once they committed to cross. As documented in the detailed account by historian Alan French in the Day of Concord and Lexington, the engagement at North Bridge lasted only a few minutes, but its consequences would resonate for C. In Tories, the British, seeing the advancing colonial column, began to fall back across the bridge, but their retreat was poorly coordinated and created confusion in their ranks. The moment of contact came when the British rear guard, attempting to slow the colonial advance, fired a volley from the far side of the bridge. The musket balls struck the wooden planks and splashed into the river, but they also struck down the colonial militiamen, Private Abner Hosmer of Acton, and Captain Isaac Davis, who had volunteered to lead the advance despite being warned of the danger. The colonial response was immediate and devastating. Major Buttrick's command to fire. Fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire, unleashed a disciplined volley that caught the British force in the open. The concentrated fire from nearly 400 muskets created carnage in the British ranks, killing 3 soldiers instantly and wounding 9 others, including 4 officers. The British retreat from North Bridge quickly became a rout as the disciplined withdrawal deteriorated into a panic-stricken flight. Captain Laurie, wounded in the initial exchange, struggled to maintain control of his men, but the psychological impact of being overwhelmed by colonial militia had shattered their confidence. For the first time in the conflict, British regulars were fleeing from American forces, and the symbolic importance of this reversal was not lost on either side. The colonial militia, flushed with their first victory, pressed their advantage, but stopped short of pursuing the retreating British into the town itself. This restraint demonstrated the political sophistication of the colonial leadership, who understood that their goal was not to massacre British soldiers, but to demonstrate their capability and resolve. The British situation in Concord had deteriorated from a routine military operation into a potential disaster that threatened the entire expeditionary force. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, surveying the chaos around North Bridge and the growing numbers of colonial militia surrounding the town, realized that his mission had failed catastrophically. The few military supplies his men had managed to destroy were a pitiful return for the loss of life and the strategic defeat they had suffered. The decision to retreat was made easier by the arrival of disturbing intelligence from the rear. Scouts reported that the road back to Boston was no longer secure, with colonial militia units moving to intercept the British column at multiple points. What had been a march through peaceful countryside that morning was now a gauntlet of hostile forces that would test every aspect of British military training and discipline. The retreat from Concord began around noon on April 19th, with the British column forming up for what they hoped would be an orderly withdrawal. The 700 men who had marched confidently into the Massachusetts countryside now faced a fundamentally different tactical situation. Instead of dealing with scattered groups of colonial militia, they were confronting a coordinated resistance that had grown stronger throughout the morning. The colonial strategy for the retreat phase demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of irregular warfare that would later become a hallmark of American military doctrine. Rather than attempting to engage the British in conventional battle, the militia commanders had decided to harass the retreating column continuously, using their superior knowledge of the terrain and their numerical advantage to inflict maximum casualties while minimizing their own losses. The road from Concord to Lexington, which had seemed so straight and simple that morning, now revealed itself as a series of tactical challenges that favored the defending force. Stone walls, thick forests, and rolling hills provided countless opportunities for ambush, while the British column was forced to maintain formation on the open road, presenting a perfect target for concealed marksmen. The first serious engagement of the retreat occurred at Merriam's Corner, where the road made a sharp turn and crossed a small bridge. Here, the colonial militia had positioned themselves behind stone walls on both sides of the road, creating a deadly crossfire that caught the British advance guard completely by surprise. The disciplined volleys that had served the British so well in European warfare proved inadequate against an enemy that could strike from concealment and then disappear into familiar terrain. Captain Laurie, still suffering from his wounds at North Bridge, found himself in command of the rear guard. As the British column began to stretch out along the road, his men, already demoralized by their defeat at the bridge, now faced the additional challenge of protecting the main force from pursuit while maintaining their own cohesion under constant attack. The colonial militia units converging on the retreat route represented a remarkable mobilization of the Massachusetts countryside. Companies from Reading, Woburn, Chelmsford, and dozens of other towns had responded to the alarm with speed and determination. That surprised even their own commanders. The system of signal fires, church bells, and mounted messengers that had been developed over months of preparation was proving its worth in actual combat. Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the key organizers of the colonial resistance, had spent the morning coordinating the militia response from his position in Cambridge. His strategic vision for the day's operations went beyond simply repelling the British raid. He understood that a successful defense would demonstrate colonial capabilities to observers throughout America and Europe. The British column's formation began to break down under the constant pressure of sniper fire and ambush attacks. The rigid discipline that had been the foundation of their military effectiveness started to crumble as individual soldiers sought cover and officers struggled to maintain control. The psychological impact of being hunted by an invisible enemy was taking its toll on men who had been trained to fight conventional battles against uniformly dressed opponents. The colonial tactics at locations like Hardy's Hill and the Bloody Angle demonstrated the evolution of American military thinking under the pressure of actual combat. These were not random acts of violence, but coordinated attacks that maximized the advantages of terrain and local knowledge while minimizing exposure to British retaliation. The militia commanders were learning lessons that would serve them well in the longer war to come. As the British retreat continued through this afternoon, the number of colonial militia joining the pursuit continued to grow. Men who had been working in their fields that morning were now part of a growing army that was pursuing the retreating British column with increasing confidence and coordination. The transformation of the colonial response from defensive to offensive was becoming complete. The British retreat from Concord had devolved into a nightmare of constant harassment and mounting casualties that tested the limits of military discipline and human endurance. The road that had seemed so welcoming in the morning mist now stretched ahead like a corridor of death, with every stone wall, every copse of trees, and every bend in the road concealing potential ambush. The colonial militia had transformed the Massachusetts countryside into a vast battlefield where conventional military tactics were not merely ineffective, but potentially suicidal. The British column, strung out along the road in a formation designed for European warfare, presented a perfect target for the kind of irregular combat that the colonials had perfected. During decades of frontier conflict at Fisk Hill, the British faced one of their most severe challenges of the retreat. The road passed through a natural bottleneck where steep hills rose on both sides, creating what military tacticians would later recognize as a perfect killing field. The colonial militia, positioned behind stone walls and trees, could fire down into the British column with devastating effect while remaining largely protected from return fire. The British response to these attacks revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their military training. Individual acts of courage were commonplace, with officers and enlisted men alike displaying the kind of bravery that had made British arms feared throughout Europe. But their tactical doctrine, based on mass formations and disciplined volleys, was poorly suited to the kind of warfare they now faced. Major John Pitcairn, who had commanded the advance guard at Lexington that morning, found himself struggling to maintain order among men who were beginning to show signs of panic. The psychological pressure of constant sniper fire, combined with the physical exhaustion of a forced march under hostile conditions, was breaking down the discipline that had held the British force together. The colonial militia's effectiveness during the retreat demonstrated the sophisticated level of organization that had been achieved by the resistance movement. Units from different towns coordinated their attacks with remarkable precision, creating a series of layered ambushes that kept the British under constant pressure. The militia commanders had learned to use their numerical superiority and territorial knowledge to maximum advantage, as referenced in the detailed military analysis by historian David Hackett Fisher. The British casualties during the retreat were not random, but followed a pattern that revealed the tactical sophistication of the colonial response. Officers, identifiable by their uniforms and positions, were specifically targeted, while common soldiers were allowed to surrender when possible. This discriminating approach to warfare reflected the political goals of the colonial leadership. The transformation of individual British soldiers during the retreat was remarkable to witness. Men who had marched out of Boston with the confidence of professional soldiers found themselves reduced to desperate fugitives, abandoning equipment and formation discipline in their eagerness to escape the relentless pursuit. The psychological impact of this role reversal would have consequences far beyond the immediate military situation. The colonial militia's pursuit was not merely a military operation, but a political statement that resonated throughout the American colonies. Word of the British retreat spread rapidly through the colonial communication network, carried by writers who added their own embellishments to an already dramatic story. The image of British regulars fleeing from American militia would inspire resistance movements. From Georgia to Maine, the British logistics train, which had seemed so well organized that morning, began to break down under the pressure of constant attack. Wounded soldiers slowed the column's progress, while abandoned equipment littered the road behind them. The careful planning that had gone into the operation was being undone by the reality of unconventional warfare in hostile territory. Captain Laurie's rear guard faced the most difficult task of the entire retreat, fighting a series of delaying actions that allowed the main column to maintain some semblance of order. His men, already bloodied from the fight at North Bridge, now found themselves bearing the brunt of the colonial pursuit. The courage they displayed in these desperate circumstances would be remembered long after the immediate tactical situation was forgotten. The road through Menominee, now Arlington, presented the British with their most challenging obstacle yet. The town's geography, with its narrow streets and multiple buildings providing cover for attackers, created an urban warfare environment that neither side had fully anticipated. The fighting here would be some of the most intense of the entire day. The British column's arrival in Menominee marked a new phase in the retreat, where the battle moved from the open countryside into a more confined urban environment. The colonial militia, reinforced by fresh units from surrounding towns, had prepared defensive positions that would test the British resolve to its limits. The British situation became increasingly desperate as the afternoon wore on and the retreat continued through the hostile Massachusetts countryside. By the time Lieutenant Colonel Smith's battered column reached Menominee, the men were exhausted, demoralized, and running dangerously low on ammunition. The day that had begun with such confidence was turning into a potential catastrophe that could destroy the entire expeditionary force. The fighting in Menominee represented the climax of the colonial militia's pursuit, with combat occurring in streets, yards, and buildings throughout the town. The British found themselves engaged in house-to-house fighting against an enemy that seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The usual advantages of military discipline and superior equipment were neutralized by the intimate knowledge the colonials possessed of their own terrain. The arrival of British reinforcements under Brigadier General Hugh Percy at Lexington transformed the tactical situation. Just as the original expedition seemed on the verge of complete collapse, Percy's relief column, consisting of over 1,000 fresh troops supported by artillery, had marched out from Boston in response to the increasingly alarming reports reaching General Gage's headquarters. The junction of the two British forces at Lexington provided a momentary respite for Smith's exhausted men, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in the day's fighting. The colonial militia, which had been pursuing a demoralized and retreating enemy, now faced a consolidated British force that was both numerically stronger and tactically more formidable than anything they had encountered that day. General Percy's decision to continue the retreat rather than attempt to hold Lexington demonstrated his understanding of the strategic situation. Despite his numerical advantage, the British position remained fundamentally untenable. The colonial militia continued to grow in strength as more units arrived from throughout eastern Massachusetts, and the British supply lines back to Boston remained vulnerable to interdiction. The final phase of the retreat, from Lexington to Charlestown, tested both sides' endurance and resolve. The British, now formed into a more coherent military unit under Percy's command, were able to maintain better discipline and coordinate their defensive efforts. The colonial militia, having fought throughout the day, began to show signs of exhaustion and ammunition shortages that limited their effectiveness. The arrival of the British column at Charlestown Neck as the sun was setting marked the end of one of the most significant days in American military history. The British had succeeded in reaching the safety of their naval support, but the cost of the operation had been devastating. Official casualty reports listed 73 British dead and 174 wounded, compared to 49 American dead and 39 wounded. But the true significance of April 19, 1775, lay not in the casualty figures, but in the transformation it represented for both sides. The British had learned that the colonial militia was a far more formidable opponent than they had imagined, capable of sophisticated military operations and sustained resistance. The Americans had discovered that they could not only stand against British regulars, but could defeat them in open combat. The political implications of the day's events were immediately apparent. Two leaders on both sides of the Atlantic, the British government's policy of intimidation through military force had backfired spectacularly, creating the very uprising it had been designed to prevent. The colonial resistance, which had been largely political and economic in nature, had been transformed into an armed rebellion that could not be easily suppressed. The news of Lexington and Concord spread throughout the American colonies with remarkable speed, carried by writers who understood the historic significance of what had occurred. The battles were immediately recognized as a turning point that had made armed conflict between Britain and America virtually inevitable. The rhetoric of resistance was replaced by the reality of war. The legacy of April 19, 1775 extends far beyond the immediate military consequences of the battles themselves. The day marked the beginning of a conflict that would reshape the political landscape of North America and establish principles of governance that would influence democratic movements throughout the world. The colonial militia, who gathered on Lexington Green and fought at Concord Bridge, had fired the first shots in a war that would create a new nation founded on the revolutionary idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. The transformation of the colonial resistance from political protest to armed rebellion was complete. What had begun as a dispute over taxation and representation had become a war for independence that would test the resolve of both Britain and America. The battles of Lexington and Concord had proven that the American colonists possessed both the will and the capability to fight for their freedom, setting the stage for the long struggle that would culminate in the birth of the United States of America. The echo of those first shots fired on Lexington Green would resonate through history, inspiring future generations of Americans who faced their own struggles for freedom and justice. The courage displayed by the colonial militia on that April morning established a tradition of citizen soldiers willing to sacrifice for the cause of liberty that would become a defining characteristic of American military culture. This account draws upon extensive historical documentation, including military records, personal diaries, and contemporary accounts of the battles. The narrative incorporates details from David Hackett Fisher's acclaimed work, Paul Revere's Ride, and other authoritative sources to provide an accurate and engaging portrayal of these pivotal events in American history.